In Washington, D.C., the federal courthouse stood tall under a piercing morning sun, its marble steps crowded with onlookers, phones raised, and reporters murmuring in anticipation. Inside Courtroom 5A, a storm was brewing, a legal reckoning poised to challenge the corridors of political power. At the heart of this drama stood Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General turned special prosecutor, her presence sharp and resolute. This was no ordinary case. It was a battle for truth, unraveling a $250 million fraud scheme tied to pandemic relief funds meant to feed hungry children during a national crisis. The accused formed a high-profile lineup: Ilhan Omar, a sitting U.S. Congresswoman known for her progressive stance; Tim Minette, her husband and a seasoned political consultant; Amy Bach, a former nonprofit executive with a polished public image; and Salim Said, a Minneapolis restaurant owner whose modest establishment became a linchpin in the allegations. The charges were grave: conspiracy to defraud federal relief programs, wire fraud, and abuse of political position. Presiding over the trial was Judge Marianne Keaton, a stern federal judge whose gavel struck with authority as she called the court to order. Bondi rose first, her voice steady and commanding. "Your Honor, the evidence will show the defendants engaged in, supported, or knowingly benefited from a coordinated scheme to divert federal COVID relief funds under the guise of feeding children. We will prove Ms. Omar used her influence to legitimize a program that siphoned millions fraudulently." Whispers rippled through the gallery, a mix of supporters and skeptics watching intently. Omar sat upright, her expression blank, a mask of composure honed by years in the political spotlight, while Minette avoided her gaze, his hands fidgeting slightly. Bach whispered to her lawyer, her calm demeanor belying the stakes, and Said stared at the floor, seemingly detached from the proceedings. Bondi pressed on. "We will present documentation, campaign transfers, public endorsements, and testimonies. And we will ask, if the public was misled, who led them?" With that, the trial began, a spectacle that would grip the nation, exposing the fragile intersection of power, trust, and accountability. The prosecution's first witness was FBI investigator Daniel Cross, a man of quiet authority whose years of experience lent weight to his words. Bondi approached him with precision, her questions cutting through the tension. "Agent Cross, what initiated this investigation?" she asked. Cross replied, "We received reports of irregularities in reimbursement claims from a nonprofit called Feeding Our Future. Meal counts didn't align with physical capacity. One site, Safari Restaurant, claimed 6,000 meals a day from a small kitchen." Bondi nodded, her eyes briefly scanning the jury. "And how does this connect to Congresswoman Omar?" Cross answered. "She publicly endorsed the program, promoted Safari Restaurant, and her husband's firm later received substantial transfers linked to entities under investigation." Gasps echoed through the courtroom, a murmur of disbelief and curiosity. Omar's attorney, Delmer Eror, a wiry man with a reputation for sharp defenses, objected. "Speculation!" Judge Keaton, her gaze unwavering, overruled. "Proceed." Bondi displayed a video on a large screen, Omar at Safari Restaurant, her voice warm as she praised its community role, a clip that had once gone viral for its feel-good message. She paused it, letting the image linger. This aired 1 month before fraudulent claims spiked. Coincidence? Cross remained neutral, his tone measured. "We noted the timeline." Next, Bondi introduced financial records, transfers from Omar's campaign to Minette's firm totaling nearly $3 million, followed by connections to ventures under civil lawsuit for fund misuse, including a failed $1.7 million cannabis investment that had drawn public scrutiny. Turning to the jury, Bondi said, "We're not here to try someone's marriage. We're here to examine whether taxpayer money meant to feed children was redirected, and if public trust was used to launder credibility." Omar's lawyer scoffed, "Circumstance!" Bondi met his eyes, unflinching. "Then let's bring in the evidence." The court adjourned for the day, and outside, a media frenzy erupted. Social media exploded with #OmarTrial trending as reporters raced to file their stories, some framing it as a partisan witch hunt, others as a long overdue reckoning. In her office, Bondi reviewed her notes. No celebration, just quiet preparation for the next phase. Her resolve fueled by a belief that justice transcended politics. By the second day, the media presence had doubled, headlines clashing and protesters chanting outside, their signs a mix of support for Omar and demands for accountability. Inside, silence reclaimed control as Judge Keaton entered, her presence a steady anchor. Bondi called her next witness, Teresa Malloy, a former accountant for Feeding Our Future. Malloy took the stand, composed despite the weight of her testimony. "Ms. Malloy, describe your role," Bondi began. "I managed disbursements and tracked reimbursements submitted to the Minnesota Department of Education," Malloy replied, her voice clear. Bondi displayed a financial chart, its numbers stark against the screen. "This shows Safari Restaurant reporting over 6,000 meals a day. Did you question those numbers?" "I did," Malloy said, her brow furrowing slightly. "I raised concerns internally, but my supervisor told me to process them regardless." Bondi pressed, "Anything else unusual?" Malloy nodded. "We received calls from local schools saying they'd never heard of the program, yet we reported their students as meal recipients." The gallery gasped, a ripple of shock spreading. "Were you told to keep quiet?" Bondi asked. "Yes." "By whom?" "Amy Bach." Bach's attorney, a bespectacled figure with a nervous energy, objected. "Hearsay," Keaton overruled, her tone firm. Bondi turned to the jury. Not only were numbers fabricated, the community was falsely represented, a betrayal of the very people this program claimed to serve. Next came Detective Jonah Lear, who'd coordinated state-level investigations before the feds took over. "Detective, what drew your attention to Safari Restaurant?" Bondi asked. "The volume," Lear said, his voice gruff from years on the beat. "They claimed to be a top child nutrition site, but operated from a modest kitchen. No storage, no delivery records, inconsistent staff." Bondi showed photos of Safari's facilities. Small, clean, but not industrial, a stark contrast to the grand claims. Could this produce 6,000 meals a day? No, not even close. Were federal funds dispersed based on those reports? Yes, tens of millions. Did any elected officials lend credibility to this? Yes, Ilhan Omar. The gallery buzzed again, the name carrying weight. Bondi's third witness was Harper Diaz, a journalist with a reputation for digging into corruption. "I researched Feeding Our Future after a tip," Diaz said, her tone confident. "I uncovered paid promotional materials featuring Omar praising the meal efforts." "Organic or sponsored?" Bondi asked. "Some organic, but I traced payments. Safari and affiliates donated to a PAC supporting Omar's re-election. Then her endorsement video surfaced weeks later." Delmare objected. Speculation! Bondi held up a campaign filing, its details undeniable. Public record, Keaton admitted it. Bondi faced the jury. Donations, endorsements, viral content, and millions unaccounted for, coincidence or coordination. The court recessed for lunch, the outside world erupting in debate, hashtags clashing online. Inside, Bondi kept working, her focus unshaken, knowing each piece of evidence built a wall the defense would struggle to breach. By the fifth day, the trial reached its peak. The courtroom was tense, jurors attentive, reporters poised with pens over notepads, sensing the climax. Bondi introduced digital evidence tying Omar's campaign to the fraud, a shared cloud account used by Manette's firm and a subcontracted media company. It revealed coordinated releases, graphics, message drafts, and quotes attributed to Omar, meticulously planned to amplify the program's reach. Calendar reminders for events she attended and post-campaign summaries noted her impression lift impact, her involvement boosting trust among target demographics, a metric that turned her political capital into a tool for deception. Bondi recalled Omar to the stand, the room electric with anticipation. Congresswoman, did you coordinate with Feeding Our Future? I offered community support, didn't vet every group, Omar replied, her voice steady but defensive. Were you paid? No. Aware of your husband's firm working with them? I kept personal and professional separate. Bondi tapped her pen, a subtle sign of her intensity. When you saw materials with your name, did you ask how they were used? I assumed they were grassroots. Bondi's tone hardened, cutting through the air. You attended their events, featured their spokespeople. Your campaign paid a firm managing their PR, your husband's firm. When red flags rose, you said nothing. Omar stayed silent, her jaw tight, the weight of the moment palpable. Bondi called Lara Penn, a nonprofit compliance officer with a no-nonsense demeanor. Ms. Penn, what's the first principle of federal grant funding? Transparency and accountability. Did Feeding Our Future display either? No, their reports were inconsistent, partners unverified, oversight non-existent. Yet they grew? Yes, thanks to political endorsements masking scrutiny. Penn's words landed like a hammer, reinforcing Bondi's case. Bondi's closing argument was sharp and deliberate, a masterclass in precision. You've seen records, tracing taxpayer funds to Feeding Our Future, then to campaign ads alongside Omar's smiling face. The law doesn't require intent to benefit from fraud, just responsibility. Her influence made this scam possible, turning public trust into a currency for corruption. Defense attorney Delmare countered, his voice calm but insistent. Guilt by association isn't guilt. She trusted the wrong people, not recklessly enabled them. This is a web spun after the fact, a convenient narrative. Bondi rebutted, her words piercing. Silence in leadership is permission. This isn't about popularity, it's about accountability, about ensuring no one's name shields the truth. The jury was dismissed to deliberate, the nation buzzing with anticipation, the stakes reverberating beyond the courtroom walls. On the sixth day, the rain had stopped, but the city remained on edge. A collective breath held. The jury filed in, their faces composed and unreadable, a tableau of ordinary citizens tasked with an extraordinary decision. Judge Keaton asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, a middle-aged woman with a steady gaze. "We have." The clerk handed the paper to Keaton, who unfolded it and read, On the charge of willful misrepresentation of federal funding use, guilty. On enabling fraudulent public messaging, guilty. On knowingly benefiting from fraudulent financial networks, guilty. Minette was also found guilty of financial misconduct and wire fraud, his fate sealed alongside the others. The courtroom erupted in gasps, a wave of shock and vindication crashing through. Keaton continued, her voice unwavering. Sentences will be determined later, but findings will be referred to the House Ethics Committee. Outside, headlines blazed, Omar guilty in fraud trial. Bondi secures historic conviction. Social media fractured. Some celebrated, hailing it as justice served. Others decried it as partisanship run amok, memes and outrage colliding in a digital storm. In Congress, panic spread as staffers scrubbed records, ethics reviews accelerated, and lawmakers whispered about the precedent now set, a line drawn in the sand. Weeks later, the House Ethics Committee censured Omar, stripping her committee assignments, a public fall from grace that echoed through Capitol Hill. Minette resigned, his firm dissolved into obscurity, a casualty of his own ambition. Bach and Said received lengthy prison sentences, 22 and 17 years, respectively, their roles in the scheme undeniable. Bondi declined interviews, returning to her practice quietly, her mission complete. When a reporter caught her outside the courthouse, asking if she'd run for office, she replied simply, "My job isn't to run, it's to stand." And we stood where it counted. The case rippled through law schools, where students dissected its legal intricacies, and campaign offices, where teams rewrote compliance manuals. In Congress, press secretaries now pored over legal codes before crafting tweets, a new caution born of the trial's shadow. The question lingered in the public square. If those in power don't protect truth, who does? For 1 week in one courtroom, the answer was clear. Justice demanded courage, and it had been delivered, not with fanfare, but with the quiet strength of facts laid bare. The nation watched, debated, and moved forward. The echoes of the verdict a reminder that accountability, though hard won, could still prevail.